So can you just talk a little bit about how the community needs to get together and kind of rally behind the youth to make a change here in the West Side?
I think we have to continue to try to strengthen the things that we currently have. And so when you look at the after-school programs like Step by Step has with Michael Farmer, Reverend Michael Farmer, Reverend James Ely with the New Covenant Community Development Corporation on 2nd Avenue Center, what the Salvation Army Boys and Girls Club is doing, what Darrell Miller is doing with the Keep the Faith Corporation, and there are other groups like my little organization, Hope CDC. That provides an infrastructure, and I think that we have to build on the infrastructure that we currently have. We got to strengthen those young people to build their resiliency, build their conflict resolution skills, to equip them with the skills that they need so that they can influence the influencers. And we've got to cast a vision and maintain a vision that we're going to be a healthy, a wholesome, nonviolent community. We must not give in to the despair. We must not give in to the episodic events that occur, because the overwhelming majority of the people that live and reside on the West Side are solid citizens. Our children are going to school, they're working, they're engaging, they're involved in sports and other extracurricular activities. Parents are working and trying to do the best they can for their children and their families. There's a small, very slice of our community that have not bought into this vision of a nonviolent community. And in many cases, they're not even from here, right? So we must make sure that we are highlighting and accentuating all these wonderfully positive, optimistic things that's happening on the west side of Charleston, and not allow it to be overshadowed by these instances where violence do happen on the west side. I think that's a part of it. We must not let our psyche be affected to where we lose our hope and lose our confidence in the direction that the community is moving in.
That makes sense. And now, kind of just talking about education as well. From what I've heard, that's kind of very important in this situation. I know that whenever I was talking to Deanna McKinney, she told me that's kind of one of the first signs, is whenever you see kids not going to school and, you know, they have truancy and everything like that. So again, how as a community do we get behind these maybe high school kids who, you know, in middle school they might have been able to go to some of these programs and now they're not in high school and they were taught some of these things, but they're kind of slipping through the cracks now. How do we go about handling that kind of situation?
I think that we have to develop a comprehensive, holistic youth development system for our young people. From the womb, the cradle, preschool, kindergarten, elementary, middle school, high school, even into young adulthood. And we have a tendency to build in all the supports at the earlier ages when they need more supervision, when they need transportation, when someone else has to organize the activities for them. And that's when you see the most adults that are engaged in youth football, youth basketball, soccer, those type of activities. As the young people get older, the adults sort of start to dissipate and to move away, and the youth end up having more unsupervised time and unsupervised activities. And I think that we have to develop more things where there's engagement from adults with these young people, teens, and young adults, and make those activities family events as well. I often say to people, think about what happens in our society. So at the early levels, preschool and elementary, everybody participates, right? You get a trophy just for participating. We celebrate everybody being involved, right? So when children move into middle school, we retire the vast majority of young people that played sports as children. We retire them because once they go into a middle school, only a select few athletes get to participate, a select few cheerleaders. And what I'm suggesting, we need to have a robust, well-funded youth recreation activities for kids at the middle school level and into the high school level, even those who do not participate on the school athletic or extracurricular teams. And I don't think we realize that that's what happens. So kids now have less structured, less supervised activity. They're not celebrated the way they were celebrated when they were younger. And I think kids need to be celebrated, and younger need to be celebrated all the way through into adulthood. And I think that we can do that. We just have to have the vision to do it, the will to do it, and work at making it happen.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And now, kind of just talking about what you've seen on the West Side. You said you had your first, what happened in 1994? That was the first time that you, not buried, but.
Yeah, the 1994 was the year that the violence hit me pretty closely. I've been in the ministry ever since 1982 officially. And I've been ministering outside of Charleston, right? A little small community down in Boone County, in Madison, West Virginia. So I was down there quite a bit. I was traveling with my employment at the time. So I was not as involved and as engaged in Charleston. And then then I came back to pastor the Grace Bible Church in 1994. And I believe that that was the first year that a young man was murdered in a house on Grand Street. My organization now owns, my little nonprofit. And he was a good friend of mine's nephew. And that was the first time that I was really close to someone that had a close relative that was murdered in a violent situation, and that I was responsible for officiating and for eulogizing this young man. And it was a heart-wrenching experience. I did not know that that would become something that would be common for me to have to do for the next maybe 2 decades. And over this period of time, I've probably officiated more funerals for young teenagers and young adults than I've done weddings for young people. And that's how bad it got at one point. When you move into the 90s, when the crack epidemic really was at its peak on the West Side, into 2000s, it was just unbelievable, the number of violent crimes that were committed and the number of murders. If memory serves me correctly, I believe it was in 2004 that I think there were 13 murders in Kanawha County. I think that 11 of them was on the west side of Charleston. And a number of them we hosted here at this church. And some of them were horrific beyond measure in terms of what happened. 2 young people were executed on, I think, near Hunt Avenue and 2nd Avenue. And the young lady was a good friend of mine's daughter. There was a rash of shootings where young people that had been in a program that my organization had run, Hope Community Development Corporation, and several of those young men were murdered. And 2004, 2005, it was a very, very difficult time. Now think about the timeline. 2004, 2005, we're talking 16 to 17 years ago. So that means that any young person who was 5 years of age, right, that's in their early 20s now, they were 5. And I think there was a trauma that happened in this community during that period of time, that we were traumatized, both youth, teens, and adults. And the abnormal became far too normal, of young people being murdered, of parents having to bury their children. And I think it had an effect on us in ways that we still don't fully understand. And at the time, I was trying to suggest, but I couldn't get a hearing, that we have a public health and we have a mental health problem over here that needs the help of professionals. But during that very, very aggressive period of the war on drugs, the primary response from local government, county government, and the federal government was more police presence, joint task force, more aggressive policing of drugs. And I think they may be doing the best they can, but it traumatized people, kicking people's doors in, law enforcement coming in with assault rifles and tearing up people's properties looking for would-be drug dealers. This has been all a part of what has happened. The west side of Charleston was ground zero in certainly Kanawha County and much of southern West Virginia for the war on drugs in the 80s, the 90s, and the 2000s. You go back and you check the record, the number of arrests, the number of prosecutions, the number of people that got incarcerated. And so this has had an effect on the psyche of this community, and I don't think we've ever really had that type of conversation. We've not had mental health people, we've not had counselors coming in and talking about what does this type of violence do inside of a community, and how does it shape young people's view of their community, their view of themselves. For years, I denied the effect that it had on me. I denied it. I tried to act like it wasn't as bad as it really was. But now, as I look back on it, there was one year, I eulogized a friend of mine that I grew up with from that pulpit. I looked out at his son, who was a teenager, who had had some problems with the juvenile justice system. And I made an appeal to him that you have an opportunity to break this cycle of violence. This young man had a young son himself, and I was hoping I could reach him. It wasn't 2 years later that I eulogized him from the same pulpit, in the same church. And these are some of the things that's happened. I saw one of the best athletes I think that we ever produced. And he was in the mentoring program that we had. And he got off track just a bit, but I was hopeful that he was going to get back on track. And but he ended up being shot and murdered here on the west side of Charleston. Such promise and such potential that was lost. I remember the day that I was going to my mother-in-law's. It was a day, I think, after the 4th of July, for a picnic after the picnic. And I crossed the railroad tracks there at Patrick Street, and I heard all these sirens and police cars. I said, let me get out of the way. I don't want to get blocked and not be able to get to my destination. By the time I get there, with a few minutes later, I get a telephone call and to be informed that a friend of mine's daughter had been murdered at the Taco Bell, or had been shot, and that they thought that she was dead. It was devastating, absolutely devastating to this community for that to happen. And I knew the perpetrator. Young man had been in a GED program, had some challenges, but you know, you always are hopeful. Young people find their way. As a matter of fact, that a year or so earlier, prior to that, he and a good friend of his had been involved in a shooting on the west side of Charleston, where they had both been shot. He had been shot in the chest, his friend had been shot in the head. And we were called to the hospital. And we didn't think that either of them would live. And I wanted to meet with them, pray with the family, and pray for them, and it didn't look good for either one of them. And they both survived that. I'll never forget the last time that I saw that young man. He was down at Shawnee Park, and they had a basketball league there, and he and a couple of his friends together. And I stopped him, and I called him by name, and I said, the Lord has given you a second chance. What are you going to do with it? And he said, oh, Reverend Watts, I'm going to get it together. It's the last conversation we had before the situation happened at the Taco Bell. These things affect you, and you don't realize how much they've affected you. And as someone who's been in the ministry, you know, for over 37 years, and that I often say to good friends of mine, I'm like the gentleman in the Farmers Insurance commercial. I know a thing or two because I've seen a thing or two. And I think watching mothers grieve their children, watching siblings grieve their children, or their siblings that has been, life has just been ripped away from them like that, it affects them, and probably for years to come in ways that they don't realize. So I guess what I'm saying, I think that there's been so much trauma in this community, but there seldom was a real compassionate response to the trauma of the community. It's as if the community was blamed for the trauma. It's at West Side. There's some wild, crazy people on the west side of Charleston. So the survivors are blamed for incidents, crimes that's been committed against the community. And everybody's grieving, You know, you saw one of the videos probably, and the response that a family member had to me, right? And someone I know, and I understand they were just hurting. They were hurting, and maybe I should have been more compassionate. I don't know. I did what I thought was appropriate to do at the time. But everybody's hurting. And it's as if the whole community was blamed for the things that's happened over here. And these children are not responsible for any of the conditions in this community. Their only sin, that they were conceived and born to parents that lived here. And their birthright was to be born in this neighborhood, in this community. And they really deserve better. And that's what I've tried to say over the years, right? That they really deserve better than what we as adults, a better environment, a more wholesome environment, a healthier environment to be born and to be raised in. But with all that, I'm still hopeful. I really am. I'm still hopeful. And I guess maybe I'm naive in some regards, but my faith causes me to be hopeful. I don't think it takes God long to do something big and do something significant. And I think that I'm hopeful by a generation of young people, because the last tragic death of KJ Taylor was as close to me as it could be without being a member of my family, because my grandson, Exane, and he'd been friends since the 2nd grade. And I mean, they were real tight, went on vacations together, played sports together, went to middle school together from this neighborhood. They went together over to Horace Mann and that type of thing. And to watch my grandson, who was an only child, to grieve the closest thing to a sibling that he had, and see the impact it's had on him and on his friends. And I think it's been an impact that they want to do better. They want to do something. They want to be a part of something that's changed the trajectory of the lives of young people and the community. And I think that they will, because they are a good group of young people. And they really are. They just want to have fun. They just want to do stuff and be positive. And so when I look at my grandson and look at some of his friends and the outpouring of love and support for KJ's family and the way he was honored in his homegoing ceremony and the wonderful eulogy by Reverend Biddle, it gave me a sense of hope that a seed is planted in the ground and it dies, but its death brings forth a plant, a harvest. And I'm just hopeful that maybe this time it will be different, you know. You're always hopeful that we don't just go back to the way things were, and we keep trying to move things and move the needle forward. And I'm just hopefully and cautiously optimistic to believe that maybe this time it's going to be different.
I hope so too, because you do look, there's so many young people who have died over here, and you know, you look at it and maybe things change for a little bit and then they go back. Do you think that maybe this time it could be different, and you know, that good group of guys can continue to, you know, show positivity around here and get things to change, or you know, do you think history is going to repeat itself?
I think that we're going to still see violence. I think we're going to still see people shot and people still going to be murdered. That's not the way I really measure whether or not we're making progress. You know, I look at are adults engaging with young people? Are adults really fighting to create opportunities, you know, for the young people to do positive things? Are the young people engaging and doing positive things? Are young people excited about going to school? Are they excited about learning? Are young people making plans that when I grow up, I want to do this, I want to do that? I measure it by what I call the optimism quotient, right? The hope factor, right? And the twinkle back in kids' eye again, because we've been in this cycle for a long time, and unfortunately, there are a lot of individuals, basically, that have made some missteps, have taken some wrong turns, and have gotten themselves involved in a lifestyle that may culminate in them being the victim or perpetrators of a violent crime. That's just the reality. And I don't know if there's any way short of, and this is my ultimate hope and my ultimate dream, which only a few might hold, of a major spiritual revival, right? Where people really have a spiritual transformation. They have a spiritual epiphany. I was created by a holy God that doesn't make mistakes, and there's meaning, and there's purpose, and there's significance in my life, and I want to reach my full potential, and I want to be a blessing and not cause pain. I'm always hopeful that will happen in the people that it needs to happen with, right? I shared with my church a couple of weeks ago, is that, you know, we're often not as far removed from someone who commit an act of violence or someone that might be a victim. So if all of us are trying to be as sensitive as we can and to influence people in the right way, we don't know what our influence can keep from happening, right? And so I don't ever want us to feel like we're just victims, right? It's a fait accompli, it's gonna happen, nothing we can do about it. No, there are things that we can do, and every day our actions and our decisions really matter, they really count. Our optimism, our hopefulness, the encouragement that we offer to people, it really matters. And someone is close enough to that person that may be close to committing an act of violence, that they may be able to influence them not to do it. And I think that's the hopefulness that we have to have, that what we do matter every day.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. One of my last questions, I was speaking to Deanna McKinney about this, and she said a lot of people aren't talking about gun violence on the West Side. It's not something that's talked about a lot, and that's part of the problem, is that people need to talk about it and do things about it, and that's not being done. Not that I'm asking for a response to that, but how do we go about bringing more awareness about gun violence? You know, if that's what she's saying, she's had personal, obviously, I mean, you've had personal experience with it, but, you know, if that's what she's saying, how do we go about bringing more awareness?
Well, you know, I have the highest respect for Councilwoman Deanna McKinney. She's paid the ultimate price, the ultimate sacrifice to lose her only child to gun violence. And what she did is nothing short than amazing. She used it as a platform to try to help people, to try to help young people, to try to help parents, individuals who lost loved ones to gun violence. And I just value her opinion and her perspective. So she says that there's not enough conversation about gun violence. I kind of agree. She probably knows what she's talking about, because she certainly have her ear very close to that issue. Having said that, I would agree with her. But I think we have to have a conversation about violence, period. Domestic violence, child abuse and neglect, right, which are two of the most frequently committed crimes in the United States of America and in our community. And I don't think that people are born necessarily with a genetic predisposition toward violence. I think that it's learned. I think it's something that happens to them, the way they are traumatized, the way things that happen to them, not excusing people's actions, but realizing that environment does help to shape a person's personality and their worldview. And I think that we do have to start having conversations about violence, about how do we resolve conflict, how do we de-escalate, how do we address when there's tension, to address the problem. Right across the street, my friends have on their building a sign that says Black Lives Matter, the Unitarian Church. And out of respect for us, they asked me before they put the banner up if it would offend us, and I said absolutely not, and we really appreciate it. And a very, very close friend of mine, one of my dear friends and my mentors, when he saw that sign, when it was first put up, he said, I want to ask you a question. He said, I don't necessarily want an answer. Mr. Bob Hardy asked me this question. He says, what I want to know, does Black lives matter to Black people enough to where we will stop committing acts of violence against each other? It's a question that really begs for a response, right? if we want black lives to matter to the society at large, then we have to send a strong message that black lives matters to us. And I think there are things that we have to do as African American people to lead our own movements and ask those who can help to help us, who wants to support it, where resources are needed to help gather those resources. But we have to have the vision, and we have to have the passion and the courage to have these conversations that need to be had at every level on which they need to be had. So I respond with Mr. Hardy's question. We got to demonstrate with everything that we have that black lives really do matter to us. And they matter to us enough that we're going to fight every day to make sure our children are treated fairly in school and not suspended at twice the rates of non-black kids, which they are. Fight every day that they're not disproportionately and unfairly overrepresented in the juvenile justice system, which they are. Try to fight to find caring homes for them so they're not disproportionately in the child foster care system, which they are. And so if you look at the pathology of the African American community, and if you look at some of the challenges young people are having, that would be an interesting study to look at both perpetrators and victims of violence. What was their life? What was the path that got them to that point? And that's why there's enough work for all of us, you know, and we got to keep working together. Yes, conversation is important, but we have to have actions. We got to demonstrate every day we believe our children are world class in the way we fight for them, the way we invest in them, the way we create, as I said earlier, a comprehensive, robust array of activities to keep them engaged and keep them moving in the right direction. And believing that if we inspire them, right, then they're the leaders we're looking for. And change, real change, it always comes from young people, you know. And as I share with people often is that watching my own 5 kids growing up and now my 11 grandchildren, I found something very interesting. That what it might take me weeks, days, months, or whatever long it took me to do something, to fix something, or to build something, they can tear it down in a matter of minutes. In a matter of minutes, right? They can wreak havoc. They can look like a hurricane gone through a house, or tornado, that it may have taken the mother or the grandmother all day to repair. That's the nature of being of children. But you got to hang in there with them. So that's the way I see it.